My name is Dwight N. Hopkins, and I'm the Alexander Campbell Professor at the University of Chicago, specifically at the Divinity School. And I'm just happy and thrilled to be able to share today one of the classics in theology, as well as the classics in the public arena. It's called Black Theology and Black Power, and is written by James H. Cone. James H. Cone, in fact, is known as the father of Black liberation theology, not just in the US, but globally. But before I go into more detail on the book, I think it's good to just give a context for why Cone wrote the book. So he publishes the book in March 1969, Black Theology and Black Power. But properly speaking, we have to go back to 1966 to talk about Black theology as a context for Cone's actual book. You may recall that the Civil Rights Movement begins December 1st, 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama. We know Dr. King was the leader of that movement, but actually December 1st, 1955, the movement was started by Rosa Parks, an African-American churchwoman who refused to give up her seat when she was tired. And so the police were called, she was arrested, put in jail, and then it's actually the Women's Political Action Committee that printed the leaflets and started the protest. But the men and the black pastors obviously sacrificed. King died, but we have to also give kudos to those church women who were lay people who also played a large part in the rise of the Civil Rights Movement. So what does the Civil Rights Movement have to do with James Cone's book, Black Theology and Black Power? Well, the Civil Rights Movement was one of the major streams from which Cone took his evidence, his creativity, and his theological imagination. And specifically, he took at least three things from the Civil Rights Movement. And these were all enunciated by Dr. King. One, Cone, drawing on King, reinterpreted the black church as an organizing station to give people spiritual strength to go out and fight in the streets. So that's a big redefinition of the church. I mean, in the seminaries, theologists, we call them ecclesiology, so in case you want to do some homework. Redefinition of the church. The second thing that came out of the Civil Rights Movement, represented by King and then adopted by James Cone, is that the role of the pastor or the black religious leader is not only to preach, but mainly he back in that day, he had to take off his sort of banker Brooks Brothers coat and shoes and put on bib overalls. Bib overalls is another homework assignment. That's for all you from the rural areas. I grew up in the rural areas, so I know what bib. So a top to bottom blue jeans outfit. And you would brogue shoes. And you would leave the congregation out. The pastor was the leader into the protest movement. You don't run for danger, you run into segregation and fight segregation. Redefinition of the church, redefinition of the pastoral leaders of the church. And the third thing that King emphasized in a very powerful way was the essence of the gospel of Jesus Christ was definitely a spiritual matter. So he always believed in spiritual development. He believed in nonviolence, all those things. But what he brought to the center or the essence of the gospel, that is the word of God through Jesus Christ, is justice for the poor and the widow and the working people. So those three things, redefinition of the church, redefinition of the role of the pastor, redefinition of the content of the gospel of liberation of Jesus Christ. Cone took all of those things from the Civil Rights Movement and put them into his book, Black Theology and Black Power. So that's one big strand that goes into this book. Another major strand that goes into Cone's book, Black Theology and Black Power, is the Black Power movement. So if the Civil Rights Movement begins December 1st, 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, then the Black Power movement begins June 16th, 1966 in Greenwood, Mississippi. These are all big dates and big locations for struggle for justice on the part of blacks and all Americans. We might recall, or you can read about it, on June 16th, 1966 in Greenwood, Mississippi, there was a march. There was a big civil rights march, and there were a lot of people who came down from New York and California and other places. So it was really a nice integrated community. We shall overcome. The classic themes of the civil rights movement. This time, that march was co-led. So on the left on the march, stood Dr. King, had his bib overalls, and his straw hat. And on the right of the march, in front, so is locked hands, or locked arms rather, with Dr. King, is Stokely Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael was the chairperson of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is acronym is pronounced SNCC. Now, usually all these civil rights groups will be together, linked arms, we shall overcome, black and white together, and you can see in the march there are whites and blacks together in the march. But when nighttime came and they stopped to do a rally on a flatbed truck, because you got to pitch tent and keep people going, rile them up, get the emotions going, energy. Carmichael, when his turn came, he jumped on that flatbed truck and said, "What we need now is black power. What we need now is black power." And he's just going, black power, black power. And all the young people were just going, wow, and you had an integrated crowd, and part of that crowd was singing "We Shall Overcome," which is the civil rights movement anthem, and others were saying, black power, black power. Literally, the black power movement literally grew out of the civil rights movement on the part of the youth. The youth wing, SNCC, and Stokely Carmichael represented that voice. And probably one of the most significant themes in this book is that for the first time, black theology and black power were pulled together in one text. Or to put it another way, Cone was able to do a theological interpretation of the movement for black lives, the movement for black power, the movement for civil rights for so-called black people back then, which had never been produced before. Cone took some themes from the black power movement, just like he took some themes from the civil rights movement and wedded them together in this text, Black Theology and Black Power. What were some of those themes? That the gospel of Jesus Christ, as thought about and preached and practiced in theology, was black. Obviously, this was a huge interruption, not only in the white churches, but also within black churches, particularly the older generation of Dr. King. He makes this claim on two levels, theological levels. One is that if black people are made in the image of God, imago Dei, then God has to be black. Sort of makes logical sense, right? If black people are created by God and they're made in the image of God, then God must be black. The other theological level he makes it is based on location. It's divine location. His read, that is James Cone, his read of the Christian text and the Hebrew text is the following: that Yahweh in Exodus 3 heard the cries of the oppressed ancient Israelites who were enslaved in Egypt, literally slaves, and Yahweh heard their cries, and Yahweh offered a covenant that if they were to obey Yahweh as absolute, then Yahweh would deliver them into a new land, to milk and honey and peace. So Cone said, well, yeah, following on his slave ancestors, they have the same theological interpretation. Well, that means black people. We're going to be liberated because God loves us, and God's love and being with us makes us black. So it's the love and a location of God that makes them black. So what does that say? It says that Jesus has a preferential option for the poor and the oppressed. And Cone would say, what does that mean? Exodus, Yahweh hears the oppressed in Exodus 3, and Jesus speaks out in Luke 4 and Matthew 25, and he says, how do we apply that to black people's existence today, particularly in the context of black power? So what Cone said, well, wherever black people are struggling for liberation, Jesus is there. So Jesus has to be black. That is the second person of the Trinity, i.e. God in the Godhead. So that's what he meant by God is black. So black power is saying everything is black. Even Stokely Carmichael, who wasn't known as a secularist, mentioned about a black God. Maybe rhetorically, but at least he mentioned it. So the point here, of course, is that nothing is abstract. Everything has a context. And so black people needed power because they existed in America and they didn't have power. It's also important to talk about what the original definition of black power was, because it's changed from different people all over for the last, 40, 50 years. The original definition of black power in the United States, as enunciated by Stokely Carmichael and his colleagues in SNCC in Mississippi, was two things. One, black workers and rural peasants, it's using their words, should own the land they worked on. So it was a land-based power. The second part that Black Power introduced into the civil rights movement was that wherever, Carmichael said, wherever the majority of black people lived, they should have the majority of political positions. This was the original definition of Black Power. The definitions are based on land and voting because Carmichael and his youth colleagues, they were embedded in rural Mississippi for over 2 or 3 years in one spot. Whereas King, and he played his role, he was flying around and moving to different conferences, California, New York. But these youth men and women felt that black people needed power, land, and black people needed power as far as the political realm. So Cone takes out of Black Power this emphasis on a black culture. You need to have an adjective, black, in front of everything, hence black theology. He also took from Black Power their emphasis on Pan-Africanism, that black people in the United States were part of the larger diaspora. Now it's sort of called Afrocentrism, but then it was more Pan-Africanism back in the 60s. So Cone took that into Black theology and Black Power. And also he took into Black theology and Black Power the militant dimension of the Black Power movement. But if you get to the heart of the matter, there's the various chapters. The first chapter of the book really gives one of the best, for that time, definitions of Black Power. He talks about the cultural parts, the political parts, the economic parts, the communal parts, really, and of course has a little bite, right? Because if you read about the history of Black Power, now it's all on video. The whole thing is documented. You can see there's always a little sharpness to Black Power because they're really fighting for Black Power. So his first book has a little of that edge, but as an academic and a theologian, he lays out the various themes in that first chapter, defining what does Black Power mean. And the second chapter, and this is a very contentious claim, but his second chapter is on liberation theology. And a lot of people they just get stuck on the first part because it's a really it can have a little sharp edge, that first chapter, but if you go through that to the second chapter, it's literally defining liberation theology, classic liberation theology. So in that sense, one of the major significance of Cone's book is he was one of the first to write a book. I mean, there have been articles and conferences, Medellin in Colombia in 1968, and others as well, but he wrote the first one in 1969. And he goes on to lay out various publics. So again, many times back in the 50s and 60s, you, a theologian, properly speaking, didn't speak to a whole host of different publics. There is some overlap, right? In fact, our own David Tracy here at the University of Chicago was one of the first to talk about, properly as a theologian, the importance of major publics. But Cone speaks maybe to a little broader public than the Tracy, but nonetheless, within the Tracyan genre, talks to the black church, he talks to academics, he talks to biblical scholars, he talks to the white church, he talks to the media and politicians. Quite a feat, I would say, even today as a theologian myself, to be able to speak to all of those audiences with some type of context and theme and thread to hold together. It's pretty an amazing accomplishment even for us in 2022. How might some of these themes impact us today? That's a major issue. And again, not to get into left, right, or center in terms of posture, but to speak more in terms of an academic trying to understand phenomena, let's put it that way. I think today we have some parallels because we have a lot of movements, much more integrated movements, I should say, particularly amongst young people around issues of black questions. So that's a parallel there. But I think today's situation is probably a little more broad and richer, and not necessarily better richer, but just richer because you've got movements today, queer movements, you've got women's movements, you got all kinds of movements, right? The climate movement's huge, although we had Earth Day in 1971, but it just seems like this period is a very effervescence and bubbling period. So I think the United States is in another flow period. We used to use that term when there were very creative, sometimes scary transitions in American culture. I think we're probably seeing that on a broader scale than when Cone wrote Black Theology and Black Power, because primarily then in 1966, it was the black movement. although other movements were there, but that was a big focus. And to a degree, the black movement here has spearheaded a lot of issues too, particularly as we know, the summer of 2020. Another thing is the role of women was always there in the civil rights movement. The roles of women was always there in the Black Power movement. The role of women was always there in larger society, church and family, et cetera. But today, I think more and more, even though we're still going up the mountain, we're still going up the mountain on the issue that many more African American women, and women in general, relatively speaking, are fighting with a little more community and support. There are always obstacles, as many of us know, literally today. But I think that was a big difference. Back then, women couldn't. Not only could they not preach in the pulpit, they couldn't put their foot in the pulpit. They couldn't come up and put their microphone recording in the pulpit. There were places where women couldn't go. In particular, I'm thinking about in the southern part of the United States where I was from, which always has had that sort of Black Belt South, post-slavery, black church imagery, right, where I come out of. I think that's a big difference today. I have 2 daughters, so I'm very thankful for that. Also, I think today the movement is much more connected to the global. So what happened in 2020 just spread across, I don't know what the figure is, was it like, 100 countries or something? The issue of climate, whatever your position is on it, is spread globally. And obviously a big difference between Cone's time and 66 and 69 and now is the rapid prairie fire move of social media. Social media. For some of us who are alive, people didn't find out till 2 days later that Dr. King had been assassinated. Today, my daughters would are you crazy? Are you a caveman? We didn't have social media, and the television went off at 11 o'clock. I'm dating myself. But that's some of the contrasts that Cone's generation had to do with and compare to today. But I do think one of the similarities is this text still has resonance to the various publics today. Chapter 1 on what it means to be a part of Black Power or a progressive movement, focused on African American, but also integrated struggles. The importance of speaking to multiple publics, I think, is so key. Ecclesial, that is church and religious, broader civic public, as well as the academy. And oh my goodness, his chapter on the media is very relevant today, speaking to the media. Those are some of the connections that we might learn or use when we talk about Cone's book back in the 60s and today's situation. What about how this might have impacted my own thinking and informed my own thinking? So here I can talk about a little theological biography, but also just structural biography. I was, when I graduated from college, I was going to go to business school. But I wanted to take some time off and give back to the community. I had a high school that was very bourgeois, college was very bourgeois, 9 years in the Boston area. So I said, well, before I go to business school, I'm gonna go to the people. And I really, on a more Southern Hopkins tradition, we grew up, each one, teach one, lifting as you climb, always service. I mean, if you can hear my father in my head now, always serve. So I said, 9 years of bourgeois elite education, I've got to give back. And of course, I came out of the Southern Black church. So I said, well, okay, so literally a friend of mine from college, we drove down from Boston to Cambridge to New York City, and we just went into an abandoned building. At that age, you can do all kinds of stuff, right? And we just camped out and started helping people, old school organizing. And then 1 year, it was supposed to be that 1 year, then go to B school, turned into 5. I said, I can't leave these old Black people. They can't write checkbooks. They've never been downtown. The churches need help. And oh my God, some instances of police brutality. History repeats itself. No heat in the winter, no air conditioning in the summer, elevators. So I got to help these people. So 1 year turned to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. And then one summer, my friend who had come down with me 5 years prior from college to do organizing in Harlem, he gave me a 2-page goldenrod Xerox of an article. And I still have it at home in my we had file cabinets then. We didn't have the cloud, so all our stuff was in. And so it's New York City. It's August. It's hot. It's okay, give me an article. So I sort of skimmed at it, then I put it away, and something moved me literally to about maybe 4 or 5 days later, 7 days later. So let me look. What did he give me? And I hadn't thrown it away. And I looked at it, and the title of the essay is The White Left Must Deal with Racism. I was like, interesting. And then I looked at it, so this black guy with a big afro. I was like, who is this guy? Then it talked about him being ordained, but also fighting for justice. And I said, oh, wow, church is fighting for justice, and it's a spiritual location? And then he talked about this thing about seminary, which I thought was a typo for cemetery, because I'd never heard of a seminary. And some people still think seminaries are cemeteries. Not me. I love my experience. And then stuff about black theology and civil rights and black. And I just said, my goodness, I'm going to give the guy a call. I mean, I know at major research institutions like UChicago, we're big. In the summertime, we're like faculty, we're gone, because we're going to spend those 3 months writing a book, traveling, recharging our batteries, planning our next courses for the next year or two. We're not going to be in my office. We're not going to be in our office for the whole summer. So I was like, who knows? I called him. He picked up the phone in his office. And he said, hello? I said, yes, Dr. Cone. Yes. And I told him how. He says, well, can you come here day after tomorrow? I said, yes, doctor, I can be there. So actually, it's so funny, because where I was living in Harlem, you go up the hill to Teachers College, cross the street, and there's Union Seminary. I've been there for 5 years, had never been to Union Seminary. So I just go up the hill, Teachers College, cross Broadway, and went up to Brown Tower, the 6th floor, where his office was, and we started talking. We talked for about 4 or 5 hours about church, about religion, about theology, about black power, about all he was working on. And after those 4 or 5 hours, literally, so of course it's the summer, so there's no classes or anything like that. So he had the time, I had the time. He said to me, you go downstairs to the 2nd floor to Reverend Bonnie Roseborough's office. She is the one who admits people into the MDiv program. And you tell her, I told you, you're starting the MDiv program. And I went, okay, did I come here to go to seminary? And that's what happened. And I read this book and that essay, and it impacted the course of my entire academic career. So it had a deep, deep reflection. And my story was not unusual for many African-American young people then. They had followed the critique of King and the church, and they had followed Stokely Carmichael's and the youth movement's exodus out of the black church. It wasn't that they weren't religious, or even some still believed in Jesus, but they just said, we can't go with this black church. We're not, we're going to have black power, right? We're not going to turn the cheek anymore. So a whole generation of young people left the church because of what they understood at the young age, right? This is not happening, black people. We can't do this. But what Cone's book did was he brought a whole generation of blacks back into the church with this book, Black Theology and Black Power. And he basically said that the slogan, the movement, the effervescence, the challenges and opportunities of the Black Power movement, not only were they not antithetical to the gospel of Jesus Christ, he said the Black Power movement itself is the essence of the gospel of liberation of Jesus Christ. And you can imagine all hell broke out, particularly in the academies. And even some black churches said, we're distant, no, we're getting away from black theology. But that little equation about Black Power movement and gospel and liberation of Jesus Christ brought a whole generation. It brought me back. I mean, I could give names of people, which I won't because I wouldn't have enough time to list them, over the years, particularly in the 60s and 70s and 80s, brought a whole generation of African American, particularly men, back into the church as well into the seminary. So it was an amazing run, amazing journey. There have been, Cone's book has started this whole thing. And he had a specific plan. He had a very specific plan on what he wanted to do with black theology and black power. This is the first book, right? And I think he may have published maybe 14 or 15 more since then. But his plan was he was going to make sure that the academy and the broader churches and the broader societies understood black theology and black power. And he had a plan, and there was 3 parts, at least 3 parts of this plan. One, produce PhD students, so you'd have literally generations, and I'm considered a second generation. I got my PhD in MDiv with him, so I'm considered part of the second generation of James Cone. You've got to have generations, PhD students. Second, write books, and so he wrote like 15 books or so. And the third thing is to globalize it. And he went all around the world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, Pacific, Eastern Europe, Northern Europe, Southern Europe, everywhere, and talking about black power and black theology, black power, and what it meant. And thanks to that strategy, it's still a text that people are still, reading and maybe using. I know for a long time, and maybe less, or maybe more, churches were using this book. I've taught Bible study with this book. I've taught small community things, even on the south side of Chicago, using this text. Conferences have been built around the book as well. And other things Cone has done since March of 1969, when this book was published. If you're interested in following up on some of these issues we talked about based on Cone's Black Theology and Black Power, I can suggest at least 4 books. One, Cone's last book, Said I Wasn't Going to Tell Nobody. The last book of Cone, sort of his test, he knew he was dying of cancer. So he rushed and finished up his last book. So it's sort of like his last will and testament theological autobiographical reflection on all he's done and how it's from the Black Theology and Black Power to the end. And it's just a very, very moving and very insightful and a very good summary. One of the things that Cone's book sparked, maybe in a reaction to his first book, Black Theology and Black Power, was the absence of black women. Book 2, Dolores Williams' book, Sisters in the Wilderness. Cone was critiqued, oh my goodness, from his first book, Black Theology and Black Power. He began to get a pushback, necessarily sort of just critique on the gender issue. One of the great texts is by Dolores Williams, and it's the only book she's written. So look her up, and you can read her book, Sisters in the Wilderness. As I understand, those black women scholars, church leaders, and public intellectuals who created women's theology, they were trying to do a couple of things. They were trying to provide a space, both a theological space and a physical space, where black American women could come together and celebrate theologically and ethically, particularly in their writings, the unique gift that God had given them as African American women. But at the same time, they felt that their wholeness, theological wholeness in their very being, was being fragmented, because one camp wanted them to say, no, you got to stick with us and claim your gender. And the other camp said, well, you're black. It's part of the black church and black family. It's just no. Black women were saying, Jackie Grant, Katie Cannon, Dolores Williams were all saying, we are in the image of God, and we are holistic in our creation. So we're going to be black and woman. And womanist theology arose out of that. And then, if I may share 2 of my books, which you might want to look at. One is called Black Theology, Essays on Gender Perspectives. The other book of mine, which is a companion volume, but it's separate, independent, stands on its own, is called, similar title, Black Theology, Essays on Global Perspectives. Well, that's the end of our sharing now, and I hope you enjoy this along with the other parts of the series.